Hello and welcome to Comic Culture. I'm Terrence Dollard, a professor in the Department of Mass Communication at UNC Pembroke. Our guest today is David Petersen, the creator of Mouse Guard. David, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I guess the first question is, what is Mouse Guard all about?
Mouse Guard is a medieval comic series about medieval mice who struggle to survive against all the world's harsh conditions and predators, things larger than them. They're an altruistic group that just do it for the good of mouse culture in order for it to survive and succeed. They wear capes, they have swords and axes and things like that, and they patrol the open country between mouse cities, making sure that predators aren't setting up dens, and the deliveries of grain and mail and things like that for mouse culture can get through.
Now, it's one of the most beautifully illustrated books I've seen in a very long time, and it's just interesting because you have some very serious action and adventure going on in this book, and yet it's these, I hate to say it, adorable mice who are the heroes, heroines, and villains. So why did you choose to use mice as characters?
I like animal stories, so I knew I was going to do some kind of an animal story. And it just developed out of, I thought I was going to use more animal species as main characters. But I wanted to keep predator-prey relationships right and intact the way we know them. And by doing so, I realized I was going to eliminate certain species from the story because you can't have smaller characters, smaller things lower on the food chain involved in a story where a fox could just turn around and eat the other player in the scene. And I realized that was actually the interesting concept. That was the heart of the story, was something that would be like an underdog, like a mouse, that everything would want to either eat them or is a competitor for the same grain source and bigger and stronger and faster than them. So it's just they're a great stand-in for an underdog type character, for someone who's downtrodden and yet perseveres.
Now, you've written, I guess you've done some story arcs based around various seasons. So there was fall, winter, spring, I assume summer. Now, is there an overall story that you had in mind when you started, or is it something where it just sort of developed as you went along?
It's a little of both. I started working on Mouse Guard concepts when I was in college, 1996. And two things kind of prevented me from working on it in full then. One, I was in college, and there was a lot of stuff to do that wasn't a freelance comic book project. The other was that I was introduced to a young adult novel series called Redwall that's also about medieval mice, and also badgers and otters and hedgehogs and other species too. But I read those books, the first couple of books, and I went, these are really good, and I think that this author's doing more with this concept than I feel I could bring to the table. So I kind of sat on it for about 9 years. In that 9 years, I graduated. I, started trying to make a living for myself, and being able to pay my own rent. Married my wife, all those kind of things. We got a house of our own, and so and then that was around the time that I thought I need to take art more seriously, and I need to maybe try to have a career where I'm telling stories with artwork for a living. And that's when I started Mouse Guard. But those 9 years there between the initial concept and when I started working on it in earnest, I had stories just kind of sprouting up. They were germinating. They were taking seed. So when I started drawing it, I already had a lot of stories in mind and direction that it could go. But I took a heavy editor's pen to that work. So I have ideas where this should go, but I'm constantly revising those ideas and making sure that they're up to my today standards instead of my 1996 college boy standards.
Well, that's interesting. I'm fortunate enough to teach a screenwriting course on the campus here, and one of the things we talk about are how events in a story should be driven by the characters who live the events of the story. And is that something you found? Like you said that you're constantly revising what you do. Is that based on you get a better sense of who the characters are, and maybe this character wouldn't do this in this situation because you understand them better?
Sure, sure. Definitely. I've had a pretty good understanding of the characters since day one. A lot of them are based on friends of mine, or kind of archetypes of those friends' personalities. We did a lot of role playing games. Oh, hi, Autumn. My my dog's decided to join us. We did a lot of role playing, Dungeons and Dragons, that kind of thing. So I had a sense of who they were as these kind of larger than life characters and how they would interact in intense and stressful situations, like trying to steal eggs from a dragon or something like that. So I thought I know the characters, but between those early days and now, and even at the beginning of Mouse Guard in earnest around 94 or 2004, 2005, I wasn't as mature as a writer. Every time you do a little bit more work, I think you grow, you learn, you start shedding some of the tropes and tricks that you've just picked up that become cliche. When you're influenced by filmmakers or other authors or other comics, you go, oh yeah, I could do a moment like that guy did. And you realize everybody's done a moment like that guy, and by copying him, you're just, you're adding to that cliche, and you can do things that might be a little bit more advanced, a little bit more subtle, a little bit more developed. So some of the editing is just, with every day I'm a little bit older and hopefully a little bit wiser, and I'm a little smarter today than I was last week, and I can add that perspective to fixing scripts or trying to make the characters more well-rounded and not a one-dimensional, larger than life archetype based on role playing from 20 years ago. But I can try to help develop those characters more.
Well, it's interesting because do you find yourself tempted to go back and tweak something that's already been published? It's going to come out in a collected volume, and you know that you have that opportunity to go, oh, that panel just never looked right to me, or I'm going to change this one little element. Or do you find yourself tempted to do that, and have you given into temptation?
I have been tempted, and I have not really given into temptation. I go back and I look at the first book and I cringe. There's a lot of stuff there that I wish I could redo. I wish I could make it look better. Even in the first book, I wish that I could even rewrite things like entire scenes. But I put a rule down for myself that I wouldn't do any of that. I wouldn't George Lucas it.
Wow.
There's a danger with it that you can get caught up in a never-ending loop of going back and revising, because in the same way that when I initially did that thing that now I think that needs revision, when I initially did it, I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought it was good. And now I have perspective and I go, well, it's not as good as it could be, and I make a change based on today's perspective. Well, tomorrow I might decide that the revision was the wrong decision and not the right fit. So it can just be a never-ending loop. Where do you stop? So the only kind of revisions like that I do are either proofreading kind of things. If we missed something when it was in issue form that's a typo or a problem like that, we obviously fix those. Or if it's a color printing issue, if it printed too light or too dark, or too red or too green based on what I expected it to print, I'll adjust files. The only thing other than that I've ever gone back and revised from a first printing to a second printing in terms of art and story is I had a family tree shown in a comic, mm-hmm. And then when it was time to do the hardcover, I add all these extras. I add town cutaways and field guides and things like that. I was going to show a more complete version of the family tree. I pulled the issue down off the shelf that had already been printed that had that family tree, just so I could kind of reference it and make notes. And I transposed some things and inadvertently kind of implied incest. If you actually follow the names, it implies incest. Now, that's not at all what I intended to do, and I caught it after it had been published, so I had to go back, and the family tree was all hand-drawn artwork. It wasn't a font. So I had to hand draw the correct name again and then do a little digital patch and put it in there and get the files to the publisher so that the next time that goes back to press, we'll have a corrected version. But other than that, I don't go down that slippery slope because I would rather put the effort into making my next book better than just constantly trying to revise my past work. Once it's published, it's done. Revision for that is over. It exists as that thing. It has a life of its own.
Yeah, and it sort of reflects where you are at a particular moment in your life, and
exactly.
And I think a lot of times too, and I think you've got a dog, we've got falling posters, by the way. I think a lot of times moments that artists choose to change affect the audience in a way like when George Lucas decided that Greedo would shoot first. I don't think he was thinking that there'd be this outcry for another 20 years about, well, Han Solo shot first.
Yeah.
That Disney's finally going back and, silencing people like me who keep saying, but Han shot first. And it's also, if you listen to music, there might be, they republish an album, and they remix it, and there's supposed to be a guitar solo there, and it's a different solo. So, the way that the audience responds to it, it might not be wise to go back and change it because they experience it in their own unique way.
I think it's a time capsule, not just of you at a certain moment in time. It's a time capsule of time. It's that moment in comics publishing in time. There's been a recoloring of Watchmen. And Watchmen is very much a product of its time. And once the new color version came in that had slightly more modern transitions and gradients, even if the palette was very similar, the transition and gradients weren't done that original 1985 way. It kind of removes what that book was. It takes it out of the context of the time that it was printed in. It's like when there was all the emphasis on colorizing black and white movies.
Right.
And one of the problems with this and Star Wars in particular is that I guess the creator does have the right, or whoever owns the rights has the right to go back and say, no, I want to do this a different way. I want to put out this version, this altered version. The issue I have is that there aren't ways to still view the original for a modern audience. When DC decides to reprint Watchmen with the new coloring, even though it was done by the same colorist, it just looks different. You could not. There was a possibility you could not get the original printing without actually finding an original copy. Now we're in a position where up until Disney acquired Star Wars, you could not get an original print. You could not have a Han shoots first copy unless you already had it on VHS or something. Mm-hmm. It's almost like silencing the future or silencing the past. You're trying to almost edit that never even happened. It's not just that you're editing it for that release. It's like you're saying it never happened the other way.
That's true. It does open a whole can of worms. Now, I did mention that Mouse Guard is just one of the most beautifully illustrated books on the market. And you recently won a Harvey Award, which I think was for the most recent.
For Black Axe.
And I just wanted to find out what your art process is. I mean, I know that in the old days they'd put a board in front of them, they'd just start to sketch it out and then hand it off to somebody who would cover it in ink, and then it would be photographed and off to the press. But we've got a lot more options today, so I was hoping you could share your process with us.
Sure. I do kind of a back and forth between digital and traditional. I have a lot of friends who are purely digital or who do a lot more digital and try to encourage me, like, go for it, man. Look at all these tools at our disposal. And I kind of dip my toe in. I feel like I'm the right blend for how I like to work. I do sketches traditionally on paper of what needs to go into all the various panels for that particular page. I scan those and then I digitally manipulate them. I will make sure that they fit in the panel. I have a panel grid arrangement in Photoshop, and I'll cut apart all those sketches, and I'll resize them, or I'll rotate them, or I'll even take bits of them and decide that the head isn't quite right, so I rotate the head a little bit to the side. Maybe I've drawn the hands out of proportion. One's big and one's small, and so I'll resize it so that they're right. And I get that all laid out just the way I want it, so that there's there's still room for the text because I can put the text in at that time and make sure it's all going to fit. I print that out, that adjusted layout. I print that whole thing out and I tape it to the back of a piece of the Bristol board, the finished art surface. And on a light box, I'm able to see through to my to the printout, and I can ink without having to repencil it,
Okay.
or have any pencil on the board, which saves me time at the end to not have to do any erasing. It also saves the agony of when you smear an ink line because it's not dry when you go to erase, or when the eraser is actually taking up some of the ink and suddenly you have gray lines instead of black lines. I don't have to worry about any of that because all of my penciling is kind of done beforehand and then printed out, so I don't have to erase. The inks then get scanned back into the computer and I do all the colors digitally. So it's this traditional digital kind of ping pong back and forth to get a finished page.
Well, it's interesting because first off, I use a similar method, except I don't use the computer at all. I kind of sketch something out, and I still use tracing paper. I do this as sort of a hobby to keep me sane when I get home. And I'll sketch something out, and then I'll do a tighter pencil on tracing paper, and then I'll try and write to a board with. I've stopped using real ink now, which is I'm using the various markers like I can't think of the name.
Copic multiliners.
That's it, the Copic. And
yeah.
So I'm just wondering, are you using actual real ink, or are you using some of the more convenient?
I'm using the Copics. I started by I'm of the school of thought of whatever works for you works. There are traditionalists who will say you got to use a nib, you got to use real ink, you got to use so many ply Bristol, or these are the ways that it's done. There are people who are working digitally where there's nothing physical, so it really doesn't matter. As long as the final image looks the way you want it and your process of getting there felt right to you, then that's what's important. So when I started, I was using office pens. I was using like a Uniball, like a rollerball black pen, and that's how I did the first book of Mouse Guard, at least. I think I didn't switch to the Copics until I was maybe even into the third book. Maybe there was a second. I don't remember the exact date, but friends of mine were using the Microns, which are a felt-nibbed ink pen that has a better quality of ink. Mm-hmm. And I hated the Microns. Sorry to that company, but I just always felt like the nibs, I didn't get the line quality that I wanted. I felt like the line was very dead. It had no weight. It was just, it was this width no matter what I did. And if I pushed too hard, the nib would break. And the pens are expensive, so it was, I'm breaking a pen, I'm in the middle of working, I don't have another pen ready, or when it breaks, it kind of sprays ink. And it was like, these Copics, or these Microns just aren't for me. And my wife saw an ad in an art catalog for Copic multiliners, which I actually happen to have one here. They said they were, very much like Microns, but the nibs were indestructible, and the ink cartridges were replaceable too, so you don't have to throw out the whole pen when it's done. Okay, well, I doubt that their nibs are indestructible, because I'm like a monkey with a pen. I do a lot of stippling, and so I'm like just bashing that tip. Well, if you want to buy a couple, I guess I'll try them. And I'm still using that same pen. I mean, you can replace the nibs. Eventually, you kind of it's not that the nib wears away or kind of mushroom heads or gets fat or anything like that. It kind of gradually pushes its way back up inside the barrel like a turtle head, and all you've got is a little bit sticking out. So you can replace the nibs as well as the ink cartridge. So I'm still using the same body of the pen, but I've replaced the nibs and I've replaced the ink cartridges several times. But I've just fallen in love with the Copic multiliners. I can push a little harder and get a thicker line. I can pull up on it a little and get a thinner line. Not to the level that you could with a traditional crow quill, but more than enough for what I need to do.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because you talk about the lines having weight. Mm-hmm. And what I talk about a lot in television production with my classes is that we're a two-dimensional medium, and we have to create a sense of three-dimensionality.
Yeah.
And the way that we do that is we sort of layer things in our shots, and something that's closer to the camera looks bigger, as you alluded to before with your hands. Could you just explain how you would use a similar premise but with the ink lines? Or did I?
Sure. Yeah, no, I mean, anything you can do to get that space that you're talking about. What you're looking for is contrast. And not contrast like you have necessarily on a set or on a TV set or a monitor where you're, turning it up or turning it down. I'm not talking about that use of the word, but contrast meaning difference. You're looking for a difference. You want to differentiate that the space back there is somehow different than the space up here when you've got, like you said, a two-dimensional, what the viewer is looking at is two-dimensional, whether it's on a screen or on a piece of paper. That's 2D. And there are different ways of getting contrast. You can do contrast through texture. You can do it through color. Anything that makes the eye read those two spaces is different. And so you can do a thick line between where those two spaces stop, the outer contour around me, if it's a big, thick, fat line. And then I don't use any big, fat, thick lines back there. And I only use thin lines back there. Or I use really heavy, dark black lines there, have a dark line around my contour, but then on the detail of me, do very fine, delicate work. It's any kind of contrast. As long as the line work here is slightly different than the line work back there. Even the weight can be the same, just the density and amount of lines can be different. A whole lot of lines back there, very few here, or vice versa. Anything like that can help give that push-pull of distance and contrast.
That's, I think, is probably the clearest way I've heard it explained.
Thanks.
I think one of the most important questions I need to ask is, Mouse Guard, I'm going to hold this up for the folks at home. Mouse Guard is printed as a square, as opposed to the traditional rectangular shape of, Superman or Batman comics. And I'm just wondering, the creative choice that you made to go with that particular size, well, one, why did you do that, and has that given you any trouble with distributors?
It was a kind of a radical thing. I started by self-publishing the first issue of Mouse Guard. So I wasn't thinking ahead at all about distributors or anybody racking this in a comic shop or at a bookstore or anything like that. I was purely thinking about hand selling this at a convention. I would go to a convention, I'd have them in front of me. If someone seemed interested, I'd sell it. And that was a success. That was a sale. That was the end of the thing. I wasn't thinking ahead. The square came about because of the concept of doing like mini comics. In the days before, print on demand was a viable option, or even digital was a viable option for trying to get your work out there. Without paying a big printing bill, your option was to take like a standard sheet of paper and fold it in half and do that a bunch of times, put them all together and staple them, and you have a mini comic. Sometimes they're called zines, but with comics, they're usually mini comics. Well, the local convention that I go to, everybody and their brother was doing mini comics. I thought, well, if I'm going to do a mini comic, how is someone going to know to come over to my table to see it? Because all it looks like is we all have these little white these little white rectangles in front of us, and you can't really see the artwork until you're, right on top of it. If you're walking down the middle of the aisle, you're not going to be able to tell that my white rectangle is better than his white rectangle. These are the days where I couldn't afford like a backdrop or a banner or anything. Man, I gotta do something so that someone will see that I have something different. And I realized if I took legal paper and folded that in half, I had a different format, and it wouldn't affect my cost. Going to Kinko's and the difference between getting some letter-sized paper things printed versus legal-sized things printed wasn't a very big difference. So that worked in my favor. But by the time I was ready to go do that first convention, print on demand was a viable option, and I found a print on demand place that said custom sizes, no extra charge. And I didn't want to do the math of, when you fold a legal size piece of paper in half, you have something that's 8.5 by 7, I think. Yeah, 8.5 by 7. And you can see I'm struggling just to do the math right there. I didn't want to have to keep doing that math every time I needed to lay out a page and figure out how to divide the page equally by 3, or if I was going to do a bigger page and have to do the art bigger and reduce it. There's a lot of math. If it's just the same dimension this way as it is this way, I only have to do that math once, always. Mm-hmm. And I just decided to make it a perfect square. The print-on-demand place was fine with it. Like I said, my first convention, I wasn't worried about any of those things, so that's the direction I went. I really like that it pushes the horizontals. You can have really big horizontal panels that feel like an establishing shot in a David Lean movie, like a Dr. Zhivago, a Lawrence of Arabia kind of establishing shot. In traditional comics, if you want something that feels thin and panoramic, it's like a sliver. It's a toothpick on a very tall page. And the taller you start making that panoramic kind of image, the less panoramic it feels, because ratio-wise, the taller it gets, the narrower it feels. So in a square comic, I've got the best of both. I can do this kind of big horizontal that still has some space on the page. When it came time to distribute, my publisher did... When we were getting ready to sign the contract, they asked if I was interested in keeping the format the same. I said yes, partly because I liked my decision, but also because I didn't want to have to redraw the first issue. And I said, yeah, I wanted to keep it the same, and they said that's the right answer. So I felt confident by that. I found out much later that internally they were freaking out, that they had just made a horrible mistake and that no store was going to want to shelve this thing. They didn't know where it would go on racks, all that kind of thing. The audiences wouldn't know what this thing is because it's more like a children's book size. Ultimately, in that first week, a lot of stores, when the first issue came out nationally through distributed, stores had preset spaces on their shelves for something traditional comic width. And my book was wider and shorter, so it might even duck down behind the next title in front of it and no one could see it. So I guess their solution was to put a little easel up by the checkout and almost do it like a point of purchase, like buying candy at the grocery store. And that worked out. It actually helped Mouse Guard's sales.
All right, well, I'm being told that we've got to wrap up. This half hour is truly flown by. David, I want to thank you so much for appearing on Comic Culture.
Yeah,
and I'd like to thank everyone who's been watching Comic Culture. This is our 3rd season, and hopefully we'll be seeing you more and more with some more interesting folks from the world of comics. Thanks so much for watching.